Hello, everyone. I'm Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Director for Programs and Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. It is my immense pleasure to welcome you as we kick off our hashtag China Challenge Initiative, a month-long series of events, articles, and conversations around China's influence operations in North America and Europe. Throughout the month, we will be bringing together transatlantic experts and partners for discussions around 4 key levers of Chinese influence: economic, technology, military and political, and information. This week, our focus is on China's economic influence across Europe and North America. It is my immense honor to welcome my colleague, Senior Fellow Edward Lucas, who will be sharing this week's discussion. Please follow along by using hashtag China Challenge and send us your comments. Over to you, Edward.
Hello, and welcome to this CEPA electronic event on Chinese economic influence. I'm Edward Lucas, and I edit our weekly China Influence Monitor together with Coda Story, and I'm joined by 4 guests to discuss the ups and downs and ins and outs of Chinese economic influence. We have Valentina Popp from the Wall Street Journal. Many of you watching this may be familiar with her recent piece on Chinese investment and public procurement. We have Plamen Tonchev, who's head of the Asia unit at the Institute of International Economic Relations in Athens, Greece, although he's actually from Bulgaria originally. We have Matthew Minji, who is a senior analyst with the Rhodium Group. He does China macro and policy there, focusing on China's economic diplomacy and outward investment. And Bryce Barras is the China Affairs Analyst at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is at the German Marshall Fund. And Bryce looks at Chinese control over key supply chains and Western sanctions and strategic trade controls and how we can use them to counteract economic influence. We'll be talking for about 40 minutes and hope for a lively interaction between all our panelists. But I want to start off just by giving everybody a couple of minutes on what they've been working on recently, how they approach this large subject. So I'm going to kick off with you, Valentina. You've been writing a lot about this recently. What's the takeaway from your recent reporting?
Yes, hi, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for hosting this, Ed. I cover mainly competition at the Wall Street Journal here in Brussels, but also regulation. And China has really become a focus of ours maybe 2-3 years ago. So we've been looking at regulatory efforts from the European Union in regards to, for instance, having a level playing field when it comes to subsidized companies, foreign subsidized companies acting on the EU market. And a subset of that effort is public procurement. And since I cover competition, and state aid law and all that kind of stuff, this was really something that was kind of boiling under the radar, and even in the regulatory effort, which I must say is still in a very nascent stage. And the European Commission hasn't really wrapped its head around in, like, should it alone have enforcement and oversight capacity, or should it leave it to national regulators? And in that case, we all know that it's a very patchy enforcement across the EU. So we've been looking at both this regulatory effort and also at what happens in some of the countries where Chinese companies have won a lot of public procurement contracts recently. And we had a story in the late last year in December where we really dug into public records and publicly available information on how many contracts we were trying to figure out, like how many contracts Chinese enterprises had won. And you wouldn't be surprised to know that the European Commission does not have a database and does not keep a systematic eye on all of this. It's all a very nascent process there. And they're very happy with our research and said that they might want to look into that. But what we found was quite interesting, that even though foreign direct investment has been declining, Chinese foreign direct investment has been declining over the past few years, the share of public tenders that Chinese companies won has really increased. It has actually doubled. So in 2020, it was valued at nearly 2 billion euros, and that was more than double what they had won in any previous year. And you wouldn't be surprised to imagine that this is mostly in countries where the governments have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative, but not only. So the number one country is Poland, which over the past 10 years has awarded 1.73 billion euros worth of contracts, public procurement contracts to Chinese companies. And then Spain is second with 544 million, and Romania third with 440 million euro. Now, little disclaimer here, I'm originally Romanian, so I keep a particularly keen eye on all matters Romanian at the journal. And Romania is an interesting story because while—
hang on, Valentina, let's get on to Romania later, because you've kicked us off on a splendid splendid note, this idea of the shift from the old sort of idea it's all about infrastructure through to public procurement. But let me go straight to Plamen in Athens, because Greece was seen as a bit of a hotspot of Chinese influence and activity under the previous government. I guess that's diminished a bit now, and I think there's a bit of decision making going on about the port of Piraeus and what role China's going to have in that. So fill us in what you've been working on, Plamen.
Right. I'm thrilled with the project that we are about to finish. We are finishing it this week. It's a survey, a study of Chinese and Greek media and what Chinese narratives are promoted through the Chinese and Greek media on a comparative basis. And it's a fascinating exercise, which is totally unprecedented in Greece. And to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any exercise of this type in Europe either. So if you do know of these exercises, these comparative studies in Europe, I'd appreciate any tip from you. The funny thing, and I'm not spilling the beans here, the reports will be out next week anyway, but I can tell you that what comes out of our research is that there are two totally different stories. The story carried by Greek media and the story carried by Chinese media are two entirely different stories, because the Greek story or the Greek stories could be both negative and positive, whereas the picture painted by Chinese media of Greece and Sino-Greek relations is triumphant. It's Chinese media are overjoyed to work with Greece. And of course, the way they present things, Greece is overjoyed to work with China. Interestingly, the Chinese narrative is, what shall I say, a classic case of charm offensive. It's a charm offensive, not a single shred of the wolf warrior diplomacy we've been hearing a lot about. It's quite clear that China wants to be on friendly terms with Greece. But of course, this all relates to Chinese economic presence. Piraeus is, of course, the big story here. And there's yet another investment project by State Grid, China State Grid. But basically, it's about Piraeus. And I suppose that we'll be talking about it later on. So I'll stop at this point.
Well, thanks very much indeed. I'm sure we will be talking about Piraeus, and thank you for your insights on that, and also for highlighting the asymmetry, because we've been doing a lot of work at SIPA of comparing, contrasting Chinese media, Russian media, and local media about what's going on, and it's as you say, it's super interesting, the difference in how it's portrayed to different audiences. Let me go to you, Bryce. Let me go to you next. And we've seen a lot of talk about rare earths and the Chinese ability to get hold of choke the supply chain on that. But my impression is that rare earths aren't really rare; they're just difficult to refine, expensive. But tell us what you've been working on and what we should be thinking about sanctions and strategic trade policy.
Yeah, so thank you so much for allowing me to join. My name is Bryce Barrows, and I am the China Affairs Analyst at the Alliance for Secure and Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. So what I've been working on lately is mostly looking at Chinese malign influence and through that economic coercion and malign finance within Taiwan, and the sort of ways that Taiwan is a petri dish for Chinese malign influence that we're seeing here in the West. So there are several things I think we should be looking at when we think about key supply chains and how the West can use sanctions, as well as strategic trade controls and other sort of non-traditional choke points to counteract and push back against Chinese economic influence. I think one of the bigger issues that is very underappreciated is looking at how we can go ahead and coordinate at a multilateral level in terms of trying to bring about sanctions or trade controls on China. You've seen a little bit of that going on, at least in terms of announcements through the Five Eyes related to Hong Kong. But there are also opportunities, to coordinate with EU countries, as well as the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then other non-Western, democracies like Japan, South Korea, and potentially Taiwan to go ahead and push back against Chinese malign, influence, as well as economic statecraft. I think the most recent example that really shows how much the West and other developed democracies need to go ahead and coordinate more against Chinese coercive economic measures might be the recent halting of pineapple imports into China from Taiwan. That wasn't done for health reasons. It wasn't done for any other reason except to punish the Taiwanese farmer constituency in terms of electoral politics and what have you. And one way to do that some of my some of my colleagues at the German Marshall Fund and Alliance for Secure and Democracy have discussed is the potential for creating not just like an Article 5 similar to NATO in terms of economics, but, for example, the US government could fast track the import of goods that are targeted by China in order to offset some of that market, like Taiwanese pineapples. Currently, right now, they're only allowed to be exported to Guam and the Northern Marianas Islands, which do fall under the United States umbrella, but they're not allowed to come here to where I am on, the American mainland. So I think going forward, those are the issues that we should probably think the most about. And there's several others related to, going after human rights abusers in terms of economic sanctions, but also discouraging and, going after financial assets in the United States and not allowing the children or family of some of these folks that are engaged in human rights abuses in the CCP as well as the PRC government structure to send their kids to American schools and go ahead and use investment instruments and other access to our financial system, not just the United States, but the rest of the West and developed democracies as well.
Well, that's great. I hope someone from the National Security Council will be listening, will follow your advice, because they sound like excellent ideas. I had a Twitter campaign called Freedom Wine, which is to encourage people to buy Australian wine after the Australian wine exporters were suddenly tripped up by the Chinese as punishment for Australia's stance. But I think this idea of fast tracking exports when they've been targeted by the Chinese would be a fantastic deterrent. It would mean there was not much point for the Chinese in adopting these measures in the first place. Matthew, let's go to you next. Tell us what you've been working on, and do feel free to pick up on anything you've heard in the discussion so far, if you want to either praise it or criticize it, or indeed ask a question.
Thank you very much. So at Rhodium Group, really, we take a look at China's economic influence and also just the overall impact of China internationally, focusing a lot on finding, measuring, and evaluating its financial flows, especially investment and debt. We do that primarily in the EU and also in the United States, but we also look worldwide at China's relationships with BRI countries. And especially this year, we've been trying to wrap our heads around two main phenomena. The first has been kind of the slow, steady decline that we've seen since 2016 in both investment and in debt. There's both Rhodium Group data on investment that has covered this decline, and more recently from other data providers, including at BU, the China-Africa Research Initiative, Johns Hopkins, looking at debt. And it appears to be that China's sort of outward investment in debt has been slowing down since 2016. There's many reasons for that, including some of the outward restrictions on investment that I'm sure we'll talk about, and some of the measures that Bryce had mentioned. Some advanced investment screening regimes have been in place, although they may not necessarily be fully online yet, having been implemented in 2018, 2019. But a lot of that has been domestic. We've seen internal factors such as internal capital controls, SASAC reasserting authority in China on the investment side, and also changes in China's banks where they're being more cautious about lending. So the major question for us going into 2020 is, how has COVID changed that, or has it changed it? The main idea was that there could potentially be a buying spree that would increase China's foreign economic influence in 2020 as they bought up assets cheap. And what we've seen so far is that that really hasn't been the case. If we're looking just at the United States, for example, where Rhodium Group puts out a report on two-way street, semi-annual report, looking at China-US investment flows, we saw that in 2020, at least for the first half, two-way flows were down to their lowest level since 2011, around, I believe, 10 or $11 billion. And so we really haven't seen any major evidence of a buying spree that was feared. The question is, what happens next after COVID as the economic recovery takes shape? We believe that there may potentially be a bottoming out in 2020, and you might see a reversal of that slow decline in investment and potentially in debt flows in 2021, 2022 as the economy gets back on track. One other thing that we're also keeping track of that may limit that is how especially emerging market countries are handling the stresses relating to Chinese investments and Chinese debt. We've been tracking over 150 debt renegotiations since 2000 involving China bilateral debt. And how countries handle that and how they respond to the potential of new investment and new debt flows over the next few years is something we're going to be keeping an eye on. And it's something I'm looking forward to discussing with everyone else.
Well, thanks very much for that too. And those data sound really, really interesting. So let's get into the discussion. First of all, I will come back to you, Val, because I cut you off when you wanted to talk about Romania. But there's also a kind of broader question, which is this actually creating political influence? Clearly, if you imagine China owning critical infrastructure, then that is an opportunity for it creates a kind of lasting economic link. There's the whole question of who runs it and boards of directors, and you can put people on that board of directors and get influence that way. There's the dependence in the country wants the infrastructure to function properly. There may be debt associated with it and so on. So that's a sort of, it instinctively seems a big thing, whereas winning a public procurement contract perhaps just lasts for the length of that contract, which may be one or 2 years. So do you feel that this switch is changing the profile of Chinese influence in the countries you cover, or is it really just more or less commercial?
Oh, it's definitely political primarily, and very commercial is just an afterthought, I would say. I mean, I'm not sure that there is. So first of all, to unpack this a little bit, the whole region is very diverse and not a monolith at all. So you have also very domestic political factors that play into how they deal with China. But you see some governments, for instance, the government of Hungary has like a very continuous and unshaken support for China, also because the government hasn't changed. Whereas in other countries like Romania, where you had a shift from socialists to center right and liberals and so on, support for the Chinese investment also declined. But I wouldn't say that these public procurements are short term. Actually, most of them are large infrastructure projects that go on for decades, maybe, but for sure for many years. And this was one of the criticisms, at least in Romania, that they are very keen in winning these bids, but then many companies don't deliver on what they promise. Now, obviously, other companies also have very similar problems. But yes, the underlying fear that with these cheap contracts, cheap bids come strings attached, that we've seen, especially in smaller countries like Montenegro, where the Chinese government has exerted its influence, but also Hungary, which suddenly was a big opponent on all questions pertaining to criticism towards the Chinese government regarding the South China Sea actions and so on. Suddenly Hungary had an opinion on all of that, and you wonder why. So yes, there is definitely awareness that with these contracts for highways or nuclear plants, or even more high-tech companies like Nuktek, right, in the Baltics, in Lithuania, that was banned, which is a company that secures or offers security systems for borders and customs. So that also gathers data that is obtained via those scanners and so on. So it's a mix between not wanting, between having already had an experience orbiting around a dictatorship and a communist sphere of influence, so not wanting to repeat that in some countries, and just being more cautious towards what China has to offer, also because their experience so far hasn't been stellar. There were many promises and fewer deliverables.
And Carmen, what is China actually getting out of this? They've got the let me ask us turn to the Greece, because that is a serious investment in Greece. And yeah, Piraeus is a really undoubtedly an important port. But it looked to me as though after I think it was Secretary Pompeo visited with Prime Minister Mitsotakis in the summer, promised to have a US warship based in Crete. And it looked to me as though Greece flipped back quite quickly to its traditional pro-American orientation. And I wonder, when you look at what China's actually got out of this, apart from the undoubtedly important commercial stake in a commercial port, what else is there in terms of political influence in Greece?
Well, I think that what happens in Greece is quite a shift from the previous government that you referred to previously. The current right-of-center government is trying to strike a delicate balance, as it views China as an economic partner, exclusively as an economic partner, but then it misses no opportunity to reconfirm its political commitment to the West, to Western partners. And of course, the United States is a big chunk of the picture when it comes to security. One of the realizations here in Greece is that China may indeed be a significant economic partner, but it cannot be a security provider nor a security guarantor. And with an unpredictable Turkey next door, you can imagine that the Greeks are very nervous, and they definitely need all the support they can get from Western partners in terms of security. Now, what is China getting out of this? Of course, Piraeus is one of the flagship BRI projects. I would say it is successful in many ways in operational terms. But when it comes to COSCO's relations with local stakeholders, they have soured. Over the past few months, a lot of controversial issues have come to the surface, and there are very difficult negotiations underway. In fact, the Chinese ambassador is involved personally in these negotiations, which of course highlights the political importance of this project for the Chinese side. I would say that it's difficult to say what exactly the outcome of these negotiations will be. My guess is that neither side wants to have a headlong clash. But I can definitely say that the thrill is gone. There was a wave of enthusiasm in the past, possibly a decade ago, when Costco turned up in Greece. But right now, a lot of people and stakeholders and authorities are pretty much aware of all the difficulties that this contract has brought about.
That's really interesting. So the tide of enthusiasm is definitely going down, and that, I think, is a message that's hitting home all over the region, that this is not free, this Chinese stuff, and it may look good at the beginning, but the price as it goes on can be quite difficult. Bryce, you made some really interesting points about potential sanctions, both against individuals and in responding to China's coercive economic diplomacy. It would obviously be much better if that wasn't just the United States doing it, but other countries as well. What potential do you see for transatlantic and transpacific cooperation going forward in terms of a more global economic response to this exercise of Chinese power?
So I think it kind of goes back to some of the points that Valentina made about, within different European countries, there might be a domestic calculus for one part of the government wanting to be closer to China versus another part of the government that does not want to be. I think an example that really highlights that over the last year and a half or more might be the Czech Republic, given the parliamentarians and Senate members that visited Taiwan versus the president who's a little closer to China for his own domestic political reasons. But there is a lot of room, I think, for within the transatlantic and also trans-Pacific space for the United States to work with allies and partners like the European Union, like the UK, like Canada, and other countries within the Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific to work on sanctions and coordinating them against Chinese officials. I think where this becomes more salient is less in trying to retaliate against economic coercion, but more in the human rights realm. The economic coercion piece focuses a little bit more on having an understanding of doing proper due diligence for business deals, looking at the ways that infrastructure, critical infrastructure, like Valentina mentioned, does impact national security. And even though that can be done at the state level and also at the super state level within the context of the EU, I think there's a little bit less that can be done coordinating, or rather there is more that can be done to coordinate transnationally, but I think is a little bit more difficult for several reasons. But I do think trying to find a way to coordinate over sanctions and also just not allowing the free flow of movement, finances from Chinese officials that are engaged in human rights abuses actually might be a little bit easier within the transatlantic space to coordinate over. My concern is that there also does appear to be a little bit more of a break within the EU about what to do in terms of economic coercion, sort of at the state level. So you have a lot of smaller states that are more concerned about this. For example, the Baltic states, Czech Republic, Sweden, for example. However, France and Germany are a little bit less on board when it comes to these issues. And to throw into that, at least from an American perspective, within the EU, when it came to smaller countries pushing back against authoritarian influence, prior to Brexit, the United Kingdom was a very big proponent of advocating for those positions, not only on their own interests, but also for what is in line with what Americans or American officials generally want. So I think that's a little bit more of a difficult thing to coordinate over. But I do feel that there will be some ways to figure out how can we get all these different countries on the same page. And whenever that does happen in the transatlantic space, it is important to ensure that South Korea, Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, other partners that are outside of that region, outside of the transatlantic space, are involved as well.
Matthew, what's your take on that? Do you also feel that maybe we're overestimating the threat a bit, because I feel there was a time when everyone was talking about debt diplomacy traps and the BRI was going to be this huge, great thing, and we could see, Chinese tentacles of Chinese influence everywhere. And again, we see countries fairly unhappy with their experience in economic and political relations with China, and it's a pretty thin harvest for them, one could say. And as you noted, that there seems to be much less gas in the tank for these sort of things in Beijing. So, do you think have we passed the heyday? And insofar as we need to respond, do we need to be looking for new multilateral mechanisms, or is this something that countries should basically be able to do on their own?
I think certainly we're looking at China's debt, and to a lesser extent, I think China's investments, and trying to think about the influence mechanisms. I think we're being a little bit more strict now with how we're really trying to trace how we think those influence mechanisms work. The story back in 2015, 2016 was all about Sri Lanka. It was all about debt trap diplomacy. And I think with the benefit of some good research and the benefit with a couple of years of hindsight, I think that the idea of a debt trap narrative has been pretty thoroughly debunked, at least in a strict sense, whereby Chinese banks and policy banks would essentially run up the debt tab and then seize assets either through legal means or through a debt for equity swap. I think we've seen that reflects a better understanding of the diverse amount of tools that China has to obtain assets and to develop them. If you wanted to talk about potential port assets related to geostrategic concerns, we've seen in Djibouti and also in Cambodia, Chinese actors will just build a naval base or lease one rather than have to go through the long way and try and flip one. But that's not to say that debt is not an issue. And it's not to say that, especially as Bryce has mentioned in Plama with ports, critical infrastructure is not an issue as well. We have seen, although it's not probably an instance of debt trap diplomacy, another debt for equity swap, which we believe are relatively rare in Laos, related to the state electrical grid just last year, although I should caution that that's not confirmed. So while I think we've been stricter on the mechanisms and we've gotten rid of some of the most hyperbolic talk around debt, Chinese debt and Chinese investment, it's not to say that there is not a threat and that there aren't concerns about control, especially of critical infrastructure. I think you mentioned the idea of there being a multilateral response, and I think that is what certainly the United States is pursuing, although it's a more fragmented response when you talk about other specific actors. But to drill down on the Pacific, you have seen, although it's been slow in recent years, a coming together of Japan and Australia, especially as the most important actors in that region, really drawing upon the economic links that never went away during the BRI. You look at Pacific Island countries, Australia is still the main provider of aid, ADB potentially the main provider of loans, Southeast Asia, Japan still the main investor, South Korea. And so I think it's really a point of trying to leverage those partnerships, to recognize those outstanding relationships, to recognize that it's not the United States or it's not Japan or it's not the EU that has to do everything on their own, but how can they coordinate? In some cases that can be through, I think Bryce, you mentioned just due diligence, trying to improve governance around these projects. There are efforts we've seen in Myanmar, for example, with US diplomats and USAID, just to cost out these debt projects or these big investments to make sure that the decision is well understood. But also you have opportunities for co-financing. You're seeing major changes, I think, in how the US approaches export credits and export finance. I think also the EU is potentially looking at a rethink. And you are seeing very slowly joint projects in Papua New Guinea and elsewhere. And so I think the answer is multilateral. It involves a technical aspect and a diplomatic aspect. But also, I think it's recognizing that we need to understand influence mechanisms better and really drill down, get rid of the hyperbolic narratives like debt trap. And when we come to that better understanding, we can formulate those responses quicker, better, and make them more effective.
Val, I want to come to you again, because you said something very interesting at the beginning when you were saying that Spain was actually a really big part of this, because there's been, I think, a bit of a narrative in Europe that this is a problem in Eastern Europe. These, small, poor, easily led post-communist countries can be, bullied by the Chinese, and they don't know really how to do diplomacy, so they're easy prey. And I'm very suspicious of this. I feel that for the Serbia and Hungary, which you mentioned, like playing the China card, but this is done in the interests of the authorities in Belgrade and Budapest. They're doing it for a reason, and it's quite hard to see anything that China can make them do anything they don't want to do. They're just using China as a lever. And further afield, it's the big rich markets of Western Europe that are most interesting for China, and it's in those governments that the China policy and the China orientation is probably strongest. So do you think this is an East-West or North-South split in Europe, and have we been in danger of overestimating the importance of the Chinese presence in these rather small number of fairly small East European countries?
Yes, so actually the influence is probably more diffuse, but more present in countries like Germany, where you see how, well, first of all, if you look at just pure FDI, Germany is definitely the country that has most Chinese FDI in Europe. So it's not Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, of course, has a whole infrastructure deficit that it has to fill, and then there are these funds that are available, and so the Chinese companies are now figuring out how to tap those funds, just like other European companies do too. But in terms of where China policy is most well, I guess relevant to and vulnerable to influence is probably in the big countries, as I was saying. And you see how this played out with this recent comprehensive agreement on investment, the investment deal that was rushed out the door on New Year's Eve because German Chancellor Angela Merkel wanted to have this still under the rotating German presidency of the EU. And there's this whole other plan to have the whole thing adopted under the French presidency in 2022. So you'll have a full circle between France and Germany on EU's China policy, and the reluctance and resistance in smaller countries or countries that have more experience with Chinese bullying, if even, will play out definitely. I mean, the battle is not completely lost and over. This agreement still needs to pass the European Parliament, and human rights are a big issue there. So it might still be delayed. I don't think it will be completely nuked, but yeah, in short, to answer your question, I think it is a bit misleading to focus just on the East and saying, oh, they are poor and incapable and so prone to bullying, when German companies are equally vulnerable and prone to bullying, you know, and they have a much greater say in how Europe's China policy is crafted.
Good. We've just got a few minutes left. And what I want to do is ask all of you, our guests, if there's one thing that you're keeping an eye on for the rest of this year. What will be in the field that you look at a decisive or telltale or significant event, something that is on your desk and you keep an eye on. So if we could just go around and ask each of you, if you have something like that, maybe there's two things, but I prefer it if it's just one, something that you're keeping an eye out on for the rest of this year and why it matters. And if you sort of 45 seconds to a minute on that, and then we'll round up. So let me go in reverse order. I'll ask you to go first, Matthew. What are you keeping an eye on?
So as I mentioned, we're looking potentially for an uptick in China's investments. We potentially think that there may have been a bottoming out in 2020, and as the global economy sort of recovers, we'll be looking to see if there are any big marquee projects, and especially in the United States and EU, how those dynamics change. More broadly, I think one thing that I would really be looking to see would be how China continues to approach debt renegotiations. If it ends up being an actual strong partner and implementer of this comprehensive partnership that it is now inked with kind of the G20. We talked earlier about the debt trap, whether it obtains, whether it doesn't obtain. One thing I don't think that is arguable is that a small number of countries do have major debt issues partially related to China. In some cases, they're also major recipients of investment. So how China not only looks towards the future in terms of its investments that it makes this year, but also how it attempts to clean up or support the cleanup of its outstanding issues will be, I think, a major driver of what happens in the coming years.
Super. We'll keep an eye on that. Bryce, what's on your desk as the standout event for the coming 9 months?
So I think what I'm most keen to have an understanding of or watch going forward is seeing how Five Eyes continues to evolve collectively in their posture against China. So obviously within Australia, the UK, and the United States, there's been more of a hawkish bend. Canada is coming to grips with some issues that they have with their relationship with China, not only related to the 2 Canadians that are held right now within China illegally, but also just in terms of various issues around malign influence. And the same goes for New Zealand. I'm also keen to see if there's going to be further talks about wanting to add another member to the intelligence sharing alliance, or if it moves beyond intelligence sharing. I'm sure that won't happen within the next year, but I am very keen to see how some of the other countries within Five Eyes, and specifically New Zealand and Canada, continue to evolve their own policies against China, and whether or not they become more hawkish like Australia, the UK, and the United States.
Thanks very much for that. And I think that Five Eyes already is moving towards political warfare away from intelligence, and that it's a much broader grouping of countries than the original 5 founder members. So let's go to Athens next. Plowman, what will you be looking at for the next 9 months as a telltale sign of what Greece is up to in China? Oh, sorry, what China is up to in Greece, I should say. So I got that the wrong way around.
Yeah, if I can broaden the picture a bit, I'd say that I'd be looking at 2 emerging trends, or at least there seem to be some weak signals, pointing to emerging trends. One of them is that China may not be interested in its soft power any longer. It may not be, that friendly partner offering help and assistance. It may now be in a position to impose its terms. And in any case, if you go across Central and Eastern Europe, you know that China's image has deteriorated anyway. There are signs of animosity. So things may become a bit more confrontational in relations between Europeans and China, certainly between Eastern Europeans and China. And the second trend that I'd be interested in looking at would be the sort of recalibration of the BRI. The BRI has to change. In fact, the BRI was in trouble even before the pandemic. There were the signs of some recalibration being considered. Now they are talking of greening and cleaning the BRI. I'd be very much keen, I'd be keen on looking at that process and see whether the BRI will indeed be greened and cleaned or merely greenwashed.
That's a great thing to look out for. Greenwashing is not only a Chinese specialty, other people do it too. Val, imagine that you had a vast fleet of reporters. You could assign serious editorial resources to some China-related story somewhere in the world. What would you devote your attention to?
Well, since I'm based in Brussels and Europe is my daily beat, I would probably want to look at 2 things. One is how this whole recovery fund money is being managed, and in terms of having the proper scrutiny and defenses up in case it's vulnerable to being snatched up by Chinese companies. I'm not sure the Europeans are really, they have these signs of having been awoken to the new reality and the wolf warrior diplomacy of China. There were some examples, like last year, for instance, that totally took the Brussels bubble by surprise, because the Chinese government suddenly had a list of people we didn't want invited, for instance, at a business forum, which had never happened before. So they were quite surprised. So all these elements of China taking the gloves off, as Plamen was saying, not caring so much about playing nice anymore, I will definitely devote some editorial resources to that as well, because I think it's only going to increase.
Well, our time has flown by, and it just remains for me to say, first of all, thank you to Plamen Tonchev from the IIER in Athens, to Bryce Barras from the German Marshall Fund, to Matthew Mingy from the Rhodium Group, and to Val from the Wall Street Journal, and to thank you for watching this. And please stay tuned to SIPA, particularly our weekly China Influence Monitor, where we try and focus on China's westward footprint and what is both happening, what the countermeasures are. And we look forward to the days when we'll be able to have these meetings in person rather than just electronically. So from Edward Lucas in London, and from my colleagues here on the panel in their different places, thanks very much for joining us.